jazz exists in so many numerous styles and exists all over the world. Thousands of people come to jazz through a whole different set of routes and a whole different set of roads into this incredible music form, which includes everything from Dixieland jazz to Chicago style jazz, right through to bebop, jazz rock fusion, free jazz, smooth jazz, hip hop jazz. And this genre has also influenced all of 20th century music and provides the backbone of most of the styles that we associate with pop music, as well as many of the styles that we see as experimental music or creative art music. Jazz is an incredible music form, and it holds its hands with another elusive genre, and that is the blues. These two styles emerged at exactly the same time. You cannot take the blues out of jazz, and you cannot take the jazz out of blues. Those two styles have provided the framework in which commercial music, which is based upon recording, the invention of the phonograph, of records, of radio, and now of the internet and Spotify. All of this was sparked and originated with the form we know as jazz. But when we go back to the beginnings of jazz, we find that there's nothing concrete. The first jazz recording of note was the original Dixieland Jazz Band's recording of Livery Stable Blues in 1917. Before that, we have no idea what jazz sounded like. We have no idea where this word comes from. And we really don't know the actual people that invented this style of music. On this video, I'm going to try as best I can with the research that I have done to try and describe what I think is the genesis of jazz. I'm going to be going right back to source material that comes from the actual period itself, and also going to different source materials right through the whole of the 20th century. The internet now provides a brilliant place to explore these different people from this shadowy past that existed in the shadow of racism, of Jim Crow, of a country that had been torn apart by civil war, as two entities tried to free the slaves whilst the other tried to separate them, take their rights away. The dark soul of jazz is the experience of African American people, especially those creative musicians who had no other outlet for their genius and originality. On this video, I'm going to try and explain how that worked, the history behind it, and how this incredible music form was created. The genesis of jazz was not well documented at the time. What we do know about it comes from contemporary newspaper articles and the reminiscences and memories of musicians who were interviewed many years later. And these musicians often embellished, or they couldn't remember, or even worse, they tried to attribute certain innovations to themselves. And so what we're left is this space that we try and fill it with our imaginations. This history has now been affected by seeing it through the lens of modern identity politics. Of course, it's very important with what we have learned about how to deal with prejudice and racism that we consider this when we look at this style, because race played such a part. But there are certain ideologies within that view which I think sometimes obscures the truth and obscures the facts that we do know. On this video, I'm going to try and just describe what I know and what I have found out. This video is only my opinion, and it is only built out of the things that I have researched myself. But in researching this, there is actually a vast amount of material out there that points to all sorts of interesting concepts and ideas about how this music form started. I hope on this video that I will just be able to contribute a tiny part of that. And this is here to raise questions and thoughts more than to actually state the facts of what actually happened. But I hope my viewpoint as a white, middle-class, middle-aged British person who is not involved in this culture and is removed will hopefully give me a different insight. I am very aware that I am not a part of this culture and cannot speak from experience of being within it. But this is the viewpoint of someone who loves jazz music, who was brought up listening to jazz music, that absolutely loves the incredible geniuses that created this music and has viewed it from afar. I do hope you enjoy what you're about to see. It has been stated numerous times that jazz began in New Orleans. Now, there is a lot of evidence that jazz was popping up all over the United States of America. But of course, New Orleans played a huge part. And why did it play a part? Because New Orleans is a port city. And in that city, there was the hustle and bustle of many different races, cultures, beliefs, and creeds, all banging together in a post-Civil War America, where certain entities were trying to create a new America where everybody, regardless of their race, had equal rights. But there was also pressures for other entities to keep the races separate and to demote the races, especially the black people, but also Creoles, Jews, Native Americans, Italians, and even the Irish, to a lower position in the hierarchy of privilege. This negotiation through the latter part of the 19th century forms the petrol on the fire that creates jazz. So what exactly is jazz made out of? It's an incredible fusion of all sorts of different music forms that are swirling around in America and especially in New Orleans at the time. The influences that created jazz can be seen to start off with plantation work songs. This relates also to the blues. Published in 1865, the book Slave Songs of the United States is a collection of African American music consisting of 136 songs. One of those songs is a song called Roll Jordan Roll, and it's a blues. This is one of the earliest examples of a documentation of a blues, and it shows the relationship of the blues to plantation songs. The African slaves who arrived in America went into plantations that were originally set up for Scottish and Irish slaves. And although these slaves were accorded much more freedom than the African slaves, which meant that they could play their folk songs, it shows that these songs could also be related to European folk songs, specifically those of the Irish and the Scottish. Here, Wynton Marsalis explains this in more detail.
I want to make the observation that the word plantation was the English system, how they dealt with the Irish. Mm-hmm. So it's interesting that the English had a plantation system to exploit the labor of the Irish. It came in America, it was called plantations. And when people in the 19th century heard the spirituals, they said they sound just like Irish folk songs. So it's important to understand that the root of Afro-American music and the root of all American music is Anglo-Celtic music. The harmonic roots and the folk songs, the use of the sixth, and all the things that we're going to hear in Motherless Childhood that the J-Bad is going to play, that has its, as a matter of fact, St. James Infirmary, which is a New Orleans song, was originally an Irish song.
Right. The most popular entertainment form in the 19th century were the minstrel shows. The minstrel shows were a parody of what white people thought was African American culture. It was racist and it was prejudiced, but it was extremely popular, and it developed a whole raft of songs and performance approaches that influenced jazz. Another influence on jazz were the Spasm bands that emerged in New Orleans around about 1890. These bands were often young kids, street urchins, who would create their own instruments and play their own music. They couldn't read music, and so they aped the marching bands that were such a success at the time in New Orleans. We also have the practice of the cakewalk. Pre-1865, the slave owners would tell the slaves to perform, to play some music and to do some dancing. And the slaves would parody the white elite that were telling them what to do by parading around in a style known as cakewalk. And this, I believe, also played a huge part in the swagger and syncopation that we hear in jazz. Another influence on jazz would be the marches that were so popular in New Orleans at the time, especially Sousa marches. If you take Sousa marches and mix it with ragtime, you really have the beginnings of jazz. Jazz can be seen as made out of influences that were in America at the time, of course. These go back to white European influences and black African influences. The white European influences can be seen as Western intonation, functional harmony, the discipline and technique associated with classical training, French conservatory music, the idea of virtuoso performance, but also we have British folk songs in there, parlour songs and evangelical church hymns. The instrumentation and arrangement in jazz comes from Europe. Around about 1865, after the Civil War, a lot of military units were devolved and their instruments became readily for sale. And this was an important factor in the development of jazz. Black African slaves were denied their culture. And so, after hundreds of years of not being able to access the original culture from whence they came, that had to be reconstituted by black people. It is often stated that an important influence on jazz was Congo Square, where slaves were allowed to perform dances, rhythms and rituals that is said go back to Africa. But looking more deeply at this, there's a couple of things that are very interesting. Is the slaves that performed at Congo Square are actually assimilating a whole host of different influences. There could have well been elements of Native American music in Congo Square. Also, there were elements of voodoo rituals and other South American aspects to what was going on. And what was also very important is Congo Square was a tourist attraction. So these dances and rituals and music were seen by all cultures and races at the time. And so I think it's actually quite difficult to root out sounds in jazz and say these are specifically African, because the African influences had gone through the filter of hundreds of years of slavery. But I've attempted to try and list the things that I would say are associated with the black African American sound of jazz. This would be rhythmical singing and rhythmical responses, rhythms for compelling dancing, and the use of those dances in social functional music. Rhythmic drums. The drums is essentially an African instrument. Also, we see in jazz vocalization. Vocalization is singing in a way that sounds like talking, with slurs and expression and the bending of notes. There is also a tradition in African music of the talking drums, which generate complex cross rhythms and syncopation. This music is far more rooted in the idea of rhythm and time than it is in pitch and harmony and melody. Rhythmic parts were interacting, and this brings in the idea of athleticism. This music is athletic, making it through the harmony and rhythm on time and in time, being able to come back to the one. These are things that all exist within jazz. These rhythmical instrumental effects extend to the scope of expression, which could be called dirty vocalization. Conversations with flexible, pungent timbre, growls, slurs, vibrato, glissande, bends, scoops, and particularly a general irreverence, adding interest because it's unexpected. Harmony is approached rhythmically, but there is an emphasis on the pentatonic scale, which includes blue notes. The pentatonic scales are used in folk music all over the world, and many of the things I've listed are also in European folk music as well, so it's really difficult to pull these things apart. But jazz, without doubt, puts an emphasis on music of the head and not music on the page. Throughout this video, I'm going to talk about head music, and this is folk music. This is where you are playing music out of your head without something written down. But there was also a tradition in New Orleans of musicians who could read and we're reading Sousa marches, but we're reading ragtime. And the collision between those two things, I think, are so important to the sophistication that jazz contains, which was then able to be moved forward by genius musicians in the 20th century and made into an art form. Another thing that's in jazz is rhythmic repetition, building excitement as in the hypnotic hysteria of voodoo and ring shouts, the catchy phrases and the breaks releasing the pressure and allowing musicians to show off their individual virtuosity. These are the things we associate with jazz. These are the things we're going to go looking for. These are the things that are often described as the essence of jazz or the soul and attributed to the African American experience. Without a doubt, the African American experience provides a huge source of this type of musical effects. But on this video, I'm going to keep an open mind and see if it's actually more a synthesis of all sorts of different music that existed in America, coming together by a wide variety of races, creeds and cultures, and that jazz is actually the product of integration. And it's a miracle because it's the product of integration at a time when integration was a rare thing. So in that, jazz bodies the ideals of equality that we see within the principle of racial integration and racial harmony. New Orleans had a three-tier society before the Civil War. There were whites, there were mixed descent Creoles, who were largely free and educated, but not respected by the whites. And you had African Americans, some of them ex-slaves, but some of them free blacks from before the Civil War. The mixed descent Creoles, or Creoles of colour, as they were called, considered themselves more cultured than the African Americans. They often had conservatory training and were much better instrumentalists than the African Americans, as is often claimed. But when you look more deeply into this, there are plenty of white bands and Creole musicians that weren't conservatory trained and couldn't read music, and there are also black musicians who could. This is more complex than is made out. After the Civil War, New Orleans society collapsed into two tiers, white and black. The resulting blend of the musical skills of Creoles and former slaves was one of the reasons why jazz developed in the way it did, and in New Orleans in particular. To really understand how these mixes occurred, we need to look at the history of these people. So now I am going to go into deep history of the black people who came to be in New Orleans at that time. In 1709, there was no black people in Louisiana. By 1712, there were just 10 slaves. But by 1743, there were approximately 5,951 Africans that had arrived in Louisiana via the slave ships. The majority of the enslaved Africans came from Senegambia. But to state this again is inaccurate. Africa is a huge continent, not a country. And slaves were brought from all different areas of Africa. The slaves that went to America on the slave ships were sold into slavery by the African Bambara Empire, which was notorious for its practice of capturing slaves, wherein Bambara soldiers raided neighbours and captured the young men, forcibly assimilating them and then turning them into slave soldiers known as the ton. The Bambara Empire depended on captives to replenish its numbers, and many of the people who called themselves Bambara were not ethnic Bambara. In Louisiana, the term Bambara was used as a generic term for African slaves. European traders used Bambara as a term for defining vaguely a region or ethnic origin. Muslim traders and interpreters often use Bambara to indicate non-Muslim captives. Slave traders sometimes identified their slaves as Bambara in the hopes of securing a higher price, as Bambara slaves were stereotyped as more passive. Kaladian Kalabali was a West African ruler who founded one of the first large Bambara kingdoms, centered in Segoya, in what is now Mali. Originally from Kong, in what is now the Ivory Coast, he was a mercenary warlord who overthrew the ruling Koeta dynasty in Segoya. Around 1650, Kulabali's kingdom was one of the dominant forces in the region. Though it lacked a systematic framework and thus failed to outlast his death, which was in 1680, his great-grandson, Biton Coulibaly, would found a more stable Bambara empire 50 years later on the same spot. The economy of the Bambara Empire flourished through trade, especially trade in slaves captured in their many wars. One category of slave was the jonfin that could be sold. The other was the jonbar, which were put to work by the state either as labourers or as soldiers in the ton. The demand for slaves then led to further fighting, leaving the Bambara in a perpetual state of war with their neighbours, and slaves from the area formed the majority of those sold to European traders at Senegal at the Gambia River trading posts. At the time the slaves were being brought into the United States of America, they weren't United States. Louisiana was controlled by France, but France only controlled a small fraction of this area, most of which was inhabited by Native Americans. One of the things that's interesting when we look at the African slave trade is the British slavers that arrived would travel down the west coast of Africa, picking up slaves in various ports. This process could take up to a year, sometimes even 2 years. So the slaves that they grabbed in the first port could be stuck in the bottom of that ship for up to 2 years before they even started the crossing to America. And the reason for this was because the English slavers were looking for skills. The slaves that they took to America had to be able to grow and cultivate cotton and rice. They had to be able to shoe horses, be ironmongers. All sorts of skills were required. And the African slaves that arrived in America were highly skilled. This is one of the reasons why the British had gone to Africa, because the Scottish and Irish slaves that were sent over were nowhere near skilled enough. People who were taken into slavery by the Bambara could have easily died a few weeks later in warfare. And there is also a history of human sacrifice in Africa at that time. And a lot of these slaves that existed on the west coast were there for human sacrifice. So the lot of these slaves was absolutely awful. If they survived the Middle Passage to America, then they had to put up with the incredible situation of chattel slavery. And of course, I think that this experience acts as the fire within jazz. The Louisiana Purchase encompassed 530 million acres of territory in Louisiana and the surrounding areas that the United States purchased from France in 1803 for $15 million. The Louisiana Purchase marked a new phase in the development of the black community in New Orleans that gave it a truly remarkable degree of ethnic diversity. In 1806, a new black code was put into place which limited the rights of free black people. The Louisiana Black Code of 1865 then restricted further the movement of all African Americans in New Orleans, including the newly freed slaves. 1865 also saw freed black slaves start to come to New Orleans to find work. Between 1860 and 1880, the black numbers rose from 25,000 to 50,000. This created a tension between the Creoles that are now classed as black but did not see themselves as such. In 1867, when Congressional Reconstruction began, also known as Radical Reconstruction, which took effect after protests in Congo Square over segregation on streetcars, there was a period following the war until the end of Reconstruction where African Americans in Louisiana made tremendous strides in attaining equal rights as citizens. But this was counterbalanced by the growth of violent racist movements against them to suppress African American participation in politics. Congressional Reconstruction officially ended in 1877 with the election of the Democrat Rutherford B. Hayes. The first action by the state of Louisiana to legislate segregation occurred in 1890. It was then that the state passed a law requiring separate accommodations for black and white patrons on rail cars. This law set in motion the rule of Jim Crow by prompting the seminal lawsuit of Homer Plessy versus Ferguson. This was a landmark US Supreme Court decision ruling that racial segregation laws did not violate the US Constitution as long as the facilities for each race were equal in quality, a doctrine that became known as separate but equal. Homer Plessy was a light-skinned man. In fact, he was 1/8 African descent, but he was still classed as black. When we look at the history of jazz and we look at people assigned as black or Creole or white, it is far more complex than it seems. Someone that was 1/8 black was classed as black. So when Homer Plessy decided to board a white rail car in 1892, he did this in direct defiance of the law. With the government changing from Republican to Democrat, Creoles also lost political power and Jim Crow was enforced, creating even more segregation. This forced certain groups that had seen themselves as separate together and also forced other groups apart. Jazz is born out of integration, and I'm going to try and explain it on this video, but the integration is twisted and strange, where the classification of black is completely unlike our classification that we would have now. White bands were kept all white and black bands were kept all black. But when we look deeper, those white bands had Creole and black musicians in, and those black bands had white musicians in. The integration went both ways. Jazz can be seen as the cooperation of different individuals, creative individuals who are open to other ideas from other cultures, but within a system that was highly segregated. And so the fight against segregation by these open creative individuals became almost like the underlying message of jazz. When we look at the official history of jazz, there is one musician that is always cited as being the virtual inventor of jazz, and that, of course, is Charles Buddy Bolden. But there were numerous bands that existed on the New Orleans jazz scene before Buddy emerged, including Charlie Galloway, who ran a band from 1895 onwards and was actually the first guy to employ Buddy Bolden. I always find it very ironic that Buddy Bolden is held up as, for some reason, as being the embodiment of jazz when he'd already joined an established jazz group that was playing around. There's numerous jazz groups in New Orleans, some white, some Creole, and some black. There is never a point in the history where we go back and find one of the races only playing this music. There is never a point in history where you go back and say, that's where it started. That was just black people playing it, or just Creole people or white people. So it is my assumption, looking at what I've read, that these bands developed all at the same time and all brought different things to the table in terms of jazz, the inspirations. And then it's not cut and dry because of the racial situation I've described. There were musicians that had established themselves in the black world that were working in the Creole world. There were musicians in the Creole world that were working in white bands. And I'm hoping on this video to show directly that that was the case. And so what we see is jazz is the cooperation and integration between white groups Creole groups and black groups. Now, as I've said over this, I want this to be the overarching theme of this video, that I think the important thing, the thing that is not in other forms of music, is the African American slave experience. And I've tried to go into detail to really explain that. That is the X factor of jazz. And I'm hoping that on this video, I can explain what I think is the case, that jazz emerges out of that negotiation, the negotiation of ex-slaves trying to fight for their freedom and their political rights, and creatively doing that within the music that existed around them, assimilating influences from everybody and also sending out influences to other musicians. I want to start off by looking at the Excelsior Brass Band, which was a brass band formed in New Orleans in 1879 and it ran to 1931. It was one of the earliest recognized brass bands on the New Orleans jazz scene. Now, we would say that this was a black band. It was formed by Theogene Bakwe, who led this band until 1904. Then it was led by George Murray from 1904 to 1922, and then Peter Bocage, who led it from 1922 until its dissolution in 1931. It contained a whole host of classic early New Orleans musicians, people like John Robichaud, people like George Bakwe, who was the son of Theogene Bakwe. It also contained Lorenzo Tio and Louis Tio, which were part of the Tio family, a very important family in the history and development of jazz. We've also got people like Louis Cottrell Sr., which is one of the architects and originators of jazz drumming, which means drumming because that's where drumming came from. What's really interesting in this band is often characterized as being a black band, but many of these people, including Theogene Bakwe, were Creole. So let's take some time now to have a look at Creoles in New Orleans and see the history that existed there. Historically, Creole referred to people born in Louisiana during the colonial period who spoke French, Spanish, and/or Creole language and practiced the Roman Catholic faith regardless of their ethnicity. Today, as in the past, Creole goes beyond racial boundaries. It connects people to their colonial roots, be they descendants of European colonialists, enslaved free Africans, or to those of mixed heritage. Many define Creole through foodways, through music, through folklore, through family traditions, through architecture, or the Catholic faith, and often through genealogy. The word is not a racial label. People of European, African, and mixed ancestry can and have been identified as Louisiana Creoles since the 18th century. After the Louisiana Purchase, the term Creole took on a more political meaning and identity, especially for those people of Latinate culture. The Catholic Latin Creole culture in Louisiana contrasted greatly with the Anglo-Protestant culture there of the Yankee Americans. New Orleans in particular has retained a significant historical population of Creoles of colour, a group mostly consisting of free persons of multiracial European, African and Native American descent. As Creoles of colour had received superior rights and education with Spain and France than their black American counterparts, many of the United States' earliest writers, poets and civil activists were Creole. This includes Victor Salois, Rodolphe Desdunes, and of course the aforementioned Homer Plessy. New Orleans in particular has retained a significant historical population of Creoles of colour, a group mostly consisting of free persons of multiracial European, African and Native American descent. When we look at the early history of jazz, so many of the geniuses that created jazz that we know of, especially with the early ones that were around long enough to record, were Creoles. Creoles of colour from New Orleans area were active in defining the earliest days of jazz. Some of the most notable names are people like Vernal Fournier, George Baquet, Paul Barberin, Louis Barberin, Danny Baker, Emile Barnes, Paul Barnes, the great Sidney Bechet, Barney Bigard, Louis Cottrell Sr. and Louis Cottrell Jr., Joe Darensbourg, Louis Nelson Delizet, C. Frazier, Illinois Jacket, Freddie Keppard, Lawrence Marrero, and Jelly Roll Morton. Kidori, Manuel Perez, Jimmy Paleo, John Robichaud, Lorenzo Tio. These names are synonymous with the beginnings of jazz. If we were to try and demark them racially, we would have people that we would now class as white, now class as mixed race, and maybe even now class as black. The Creoles, depending on their individual background, were able, if they were dark-skinned enough, to work in the black jazz groups that exist in New Orleans, and many of them worked in the white New Orleans jazz groups. Now, the white New Orleans jazz groups existed from day one. The Excelsior Brass Band was not the only jazz group working in New Orleans before Buddy Bolden. There's a large number of them, and I couldn't go into them all now, all containing musicians of all sorts of different backgrounds, wealth, education, race, and culture. The Excelsior Brass Band, as we said, was formed in 1879. But in 1884, we saw the formation of the Onward Brass Band, which was founded by Professor J. O'Laners and was the second leading early Creole band, and it included Joe Oliver and Manuel Perez. In 1892, we see the formation of Papa Jack Lane's Reliance Band, and this becomes the most famous of the early white bands, and we will be talking about white jazz in a bit. In 1897, we see the formation of the Columbia Brass Band with Alphonse Picou. And in 1900, we see the formation of the Imperial Band, again with Manuel Perez. Manuel Perez was a Creole, and after Buddy Bolden in the early 1900s, was probably the most influential jazz musician working in New Orleans at that time. To try and give you an idea, rather than try and look at the whole of all these early bands and try and cover it all, what I'm going to do is I'm going to concentrate on one musician that was working around the time of the end of the 19th century in the early years of the 20th century, and that musician is going to be Lorenzo Tio. Now, Lorenzo Tio was a clarinet player, and he was a member of the Tio family, and the Tio family were one of the most important families in the development of jazz. The Tio family is famous for bringing the Mexican tinge to the genre, but these musicians were not Mexican. They had lived in New Orleans for almost a century before they started to contribute to jazz. The patriarch of the Tio family arrived in the late 1780s, and it immigrated to New Orleans from Catalonia in Spain. The Tios became involved with black brass bands in New Orleans in their early careers. Lorenzo Tio Jr. was born into a family of musicians, including his father, Lorenzo Tio Sr., who lived from 1867 to 1908, and Uncle Louis Papa Tio, who lived from 1862 to 1922. Their method of playing the instrument, which involved the Albert system, a double lip embouchure, and the use of soft reeds, was seminal in the development of the jazz solo. The three Tios helped bring classical music theory to ragtime, blues, and took various other jazz musicians to New Orleans. Lorenzo Tio Jr. eventually played jazz himself, but Lorenzo Tio Sr. taught a whole host of jazz musicians in the early jazz scene, and Lorenzo Tio Jr. went on to teach giants of early jazz like Sidney Bechet, Barney Bigard, Johnny Dobbs, Omar Simeon, Louis Cottrell Jr., Jimmy Noon, and Albert Nicholas. So the Tio family can be seen as bringing European classical technique into jazz, and Sidney Bechet, a Creole who spoke French, who is perhaps the first virtuoso soloist in jazz, was enabled in doing so because of the lessons he took from Lorenzo Tio. This completely shoots out of the water any idea that there was no integration going on between whites and Creoles and blacks. Lorenzo Tio Jr. also played oboe, and he joined Manuel Perez's band in Chicago in 1916, and then Armand J. Perron's band in 1918, and he worked in that band to 1928, and during that time he recorded with Sidney Bechet, Jelly Roll Morton, and Clarence Williams. Going deep into the Tio history, what's interesting is these are white musicians. They've come from Spain. They end up being quite well off in New Orleans, but one of them marries a Creole, and this seems to cause all sorts of trouble, and they lose their inheritance at some point. So we see the fortune of this family going up and down, but they're actually quite wealthy and were able to run a music school, which was where they taught New Orleans musicians. Now let's talk about this the decline of race relations in the 1890s, the Hobie Plessy case, and then the introduction of Jim Crow in New Orleans seems to have created a situation that seems to have happened at exactly the time that we see jazz emerging. The musical community of New Orleans underwent fundamental changes after 1890s, and the Creoles of color faced increasing competition for their employment from both the whites and the non-Creole blacks. The United States Supreme Court upheld racial segregation in 1896, and in 1898, the Louisiana Constitutional Convention adopted a literacy requirement for the registration to vote. White illiterates were able to bypass this because there was a clause in this: if your grandfather had voted, then you were able to vote. And of course, people in this era, if you were black, your grandfather would have been a slave or a free black, but not able to vote. These are the examples of the little techniques used by the US government to push black people down. So suddenly Creoles and blacks now have less political power. The Creoles, who had before worked in orchestras, in reading marching bands, suddenly are no longer able to work in those areas. And Creoles have to get work on the black circuit. And this is the point where we see people like Sidney Bechet and Barney Bigard get lessons from the Tio family. Musicians like Jelly Roll Morton, middle-class Creoles that have been brought up in quite well-to-do families, are interested in crossing the tracks, going over and finding out what the uptown black musicians are doing. But this thing that's often discussed about the uptown blacks in one place and then the Creole musicians in another place, and they never crossed over, or did they cross over, and that the Creoles were learning how to improvise from the black musicians in New Orleans, I do not think is the case. And I'm going to cover very quickly another set of bands that emerged in New Orleans at the same time in the 1890s. And these were the Spasm bands. And I'm going to have a chat about the Razzie Dazzy Spasm band that was formed in the mid-1890s and ran through the early 1900s. Sometime around 1890, new street music appeared in New Orleans. Small singing groups like Little Louis Quartet and then the Spasm bands, which used old musical gadgets, were added as accompaniments. These bands made their own instruments: homemade drums, tambourines, cigar box banjos, guitars, tub basses, gas pipe bugles, jugs, musical saws, spoons, kazoos, ram horns, all sorts of stuff, and really predated the skiffle movement that occurred in the UK in the 1950s. The Spasm band style was an early ingredient in the development of instrumental New Orleans jazz. The earliest band known with the name Spasm Band was formed in New Orleans in 1895 by a bunch of white youngsters. Emile Stalebread Lacombe was the leader of the Razzie Dazzy Spasm Band, which became the most famous of these groups. Emile Lacombe lived from 1885 to 1946, and he was a poor, white, blind boy living on the streets. By the age of 15, he had learned to play banjo, zither, guitar, and piano, and he worked in various bands later in New Orleans, right up into the 1930s. It wasn't just black musicians that were playing head arrangement, improvising. Here we have white musicians also doing this. What's interesting, when Emile Lacombe died in 1946, if you go and look at his gravestone, it says on that gravestone that he saw himself as the inventor of jazz. Now, obviously, he wasn't, and this video proves that. But what we do see here is that certain musicians had gained fame, and they gained fame because they'd emerged in the 1890s, and all of them, Jelly Roll Morton, the original Dixieland jazz band musicians like Nick LaRocca that we're going to get onto in a minute, and people like Emile Lacombe, believed that they had invented jazz. What that tells me is that jazz was originating in New Orleans around about 1895. There were groups that were called jazz groups before that, but I don't think they sounded like jazz. Jazz was a specific mix that was going on. If we listen to someone like James Europe, who ran a black band in New Orleans in the early 1900s, right up to the 1920s, and his band was actually involved in the First World War, recordings were made of that band. And in 1914, it sounds like standard European marching music. By 1919, James Europe was playing blues and sounding very, very jazzy. He changed his style. Now, if we never heard that group, we might easily be saying that that group was a jazz group. But because there were recordings there, we know that they weren't a jazz group. And that suggests to me that we don't know if any of these, what they sounded like. We don't know what the Excelsior, we don't know what the Razzie Dazzy Spasm band sound like. So it's very interesting to see, where does jazz emerge? And the real problem is that we don't know because we can't listen to it. And what's happening in this is certain styles are becoming preeminent. And the reason why those styles are becoming preeminent is because they're popular. I am about to move on to white jazz. Papa Jack Lane. Papa Jack Lane was born in New Orleans in 1873, and he led a very popular band called the Reliance Jazz Band. It played all over the city of New Orleans, playing for dances, picnics, parades, and other social functions. Musicians in his bands were amongst the most famous in early jazz. His band, that operated between 1892 and the early 1900s, had only one member that could read music. Again, we have an example of a non-black band playing head arrangements. From an interview with Lane, Lane doesn't recall that any of the local black bands influenced his style or technique. And contrary to the common opinion that black musicians and ragtime were the antecedents of white jazz, Lane believed that this was not the case. On the contrary, he says that the black bands who played opposite his units at Milneburg and elsewhere were constantly trying to steal his stuff. And the reason is because he felt that he was one of the first marching brass bands to play ragtime in New Orleans. Now, this is undoubtedly untrue. The reason for this is that when you start to really research into it, and I've read the interviews with Papa Jack Lane, he had a number of black musicians in his groups. But as we have said, race was such a strange thing in New Orleans at the time. These were very light-skinned blacks who were able to join Papa Jack Lane's, which was where the money was. I mean, he was literally earning thousands of dollars at one point. They were able to join it and not be found out by Papa Jack Lane. Papa Jack Lane was always on the lookout that a black musician had snuck in, and when he found out, he would kick them out. But white jazz was not white jazz. A lot of the musicians that played in Papa Jack Lane's book ended up moving on to a number of different groups, most notably the original Dixieland Jazz Band. The original Dixieland Jazz Band started around about 1905, and they have become synonymous with jazz because they were the first recorded jazz group. Now, there is a lot of myths and a lot of misinformation about this. One of them being the idea that they actually were the first recorded jazz group, because they weren't. There were other jazz groups recorded, and there were even black groups recorded before the original Dixieland Jazz Band. Now I want to look at the history of recorded jazz, because I think this holds a key to how jazz became what it is. I would just like to mention here that we have been looking at the history of jazz up until around about 1900, and I've gone into a lot more detail, a period in jazz's history that most of the history books don't cover so much. They tend to see jazz as starting around about 1900 with the emergence of Buddy Bolden, and then King Oliver, Freddie Keppard, Kid Ory, and Sidney Bechet. These are all really, really important musicians, but I think the reason why they are so brilliant is because the form has already been nailed at this point. Now, if this form that we have never heard, because we'll never hear it, actually sounded what we know as jazz, I doubt a lot. But these musicians are genius musicians, and I think we can see them as a second wave. Now, let's have a look at Buddy Bolden, because Buddy Bolden is seen as a very important musician. Now, we don't really know that much about him. He emerged in 1897, and by 1907, 10 years later, he has gone pretty much insane and he's hospitalized for the rest of his life. What we do know about him, he was charismatic and he played loud trumpet. Now, this brings our attention to something that was very important in New Orleans. New Orleans had a very high water table, and it was not possible to bury people underground like they did in the rest of the United States of America. Also, being situated where they were, a lot of the rituals associated with funerals in South America got imported into New Orleans. So when somebody died, they were taken to these graves that were above ground, and a big ceremony happened around these funerals. And of course, you had the band. The bands were really important. These marching bands that marched to the funeral and then back were really important. And to call people into that march needed someone to play a Rivalry, like you would have in the army, something to get everybody's notice. And this is what Buddy Bolden seems to be an expert at. Now, around about this time, between 1890 and 1900, there are actually secret black societies that ran bands that were specifically used for funeral marching. And I think these bands have not been documented. The white bands and the Creole bands have been documented much more. Now, I want to say this because I think what we have here now is a number of bands that don't really get noticed until Buddy Bolden actually becomes a local celebrity and starts to put focus on these all-black bands. Now, as I say, if you look at these all-black bands, you will see that there's very often Creoles playing in these bands. It also seems we have black musicians that were classified black by the awful Jim Crow laws at the time, but could well have been half black, a quarter black, or even an eighth black. And so looking at this in terms of race starts to seem quite silly to me. What is very important is that New Orleans is a melting pot. New Orleans is a place where there's lots of cultures crossing over, and all sorts of influences come together to form this style of music called jazz. So why is it that we associate it with black people and black musicians? Why is jazz seen as a black music form? Well, I think it is the case that white musicians had all sorts of ways of expressing themselves. And a lot of the white bands that were working in New Orleans were simply working there because there was money to be made. But for black Americans who didn't have all the rights that were afforded to white people in America, wanted a part of it. And they want to express that. And they express that within this form of music. A form of music created by Americans for Americans. And in the early 1900s, as we've said, we start to see this second wave of musicians, and they are genius musicians. Jelly Roll Morton and Sidney Bechet, Freddie Keppard, or Creoles, but also black musicians like King Oliver, and then later Louis Armstrong. Now here, jazz starts to become more sophisticated. Again, we still don't know what it sounds like. We don't know what it sounds like until it gets recorded. Now, I think this is the key moment in jazz history. I really don't think we can call the style jazz until it gets recorded. As with all styles of music, genres usually start when somebody has a hit record in that style. Any of us could invent a genre in music, but they only stick when they're commercially viable. When the original Dixieland Jazz Band record Livery Stable Blues in 1917, it sells 1 million records. And of course, the white companies start looking for other music like that. Now, I'm pretty sure whatever the styles of music everybody was playing at that time, once the original Dixieland Jazz Band had that hit record, musicians would have moved over to that style of music. Now, the original Dixieland Jazz Band wasn't a bunch of white wannabes copying black jazz. The musicians in that band had had that band since around about 1905, and before that, they had worked in Papa Jack Lane's Reliance Band. They were part of the New Orleans music scene, and they'd assimilated it. They'd assimilated music from all sorts of places. In 1936, the great Louis Armstrong was asked about the original Dixieland Jazz Band, and he talked about them in glowing terms in the book Swing That Music. He called the original Dixieland Jazz Band the first great jazz orchestra, and that Nick LaRocca, the leader of the band, had an instrumentation different from anything before, an instrumentation that made the old songs sound new. Now, a modern audience will now be shouting at me, yes, but Nick LaRocca said that he had invented jazz. So did Jelly Roll Morton, and so did Emile from the Razzie Dazzie Spasm Band. And so did a whole host of other people. And this often is the case. Of course, they weren't. But the idea that they didn't play a part in the creation of jazz is absolutely ridiculous. So let's now have a look at the history of recording in jazz. The original Dixieland Jazz Band in 1917 ended up recording Livery Stable Blues. This was interesting because it was a blues and because they made animal noises. We can hear the echoes of vaudeville and going right back to British Music Hall in this recording. And we can also see that they were capitalizing on the craze of the blues. Now, the blues goes right back, as we said, to the mid-19th century. But in the early 1900s, people like W.C. Handy started to write blues down. This music, like ragtime, became a hit. The jazz groups started to play blues. Now, whether blues is an integral part or something that they played because it was popular, I don't know. The key with the original Dixieland Jazz Band is it swung. It was rhythmically aggressive. There was sound effects in there, and it was a blues. But this was not the first recording of a jazz group. There were earlier recordings of jazz groups, and believe it or not, there were recordings by black jazz bands. Now, it's quite famous in jazz history that Freddie Keppard was offered to be recorded earlier, and he wouldn't do it because he didn't want anyone to steal his style. Freddie Keppard did not read music. He played by ear, and I'm sure he thought that if people could hear what he was doing, because he was quite famous for playing the trumpet with a handkerchief so people couldn't see his fingerings. Musicians at that time were gaining fame for doing things that were novel. There was no internet, there was no television, there was no recording, remember. So people would see these bands, and these bands would earn their money because they were brilliant and they would give people a good time. And I think the musicians wanted to preserve that. They wanted to preserve the place they'd got. And this tussle that happened with Jim Crow, where there was suddenly Creole and black musicians didn't have access to the great gigs, meant there was a fight going on. The idea the original Dixieland Jazz Band, however, were recorded only because they were white is not the case, because Freddie Keppard was offered this before. The original Dixieland Jazz Band went on a tour. They went up into Chicago, and then they went across to New York, and they happened to be in New York at the time when a record company wanted to record a novelty song. And Livery Stable Blues was recorded as a novelty song. It was never intended to be a huge hit record, like most hit records. But there are other contenders for the first jazz to ever be recorded. In 1913, the ragtime pianist Lucky Roberts recorded Pork and Beans on a piano roll recorder. As we have said earlier, between 1913 and 1914, the composer and band leader James Reese Europe recorded a ton of black marching music. Highly competent. There's even a recording at this time of a marching piece of music that swings and is in 5/4. Showing that Dave Brubeck was not the first to write a tune in 5/4 in jazz. But when we listen to James Reese Europe's music, it really is not quite jazz. It doesn't have any improvisation, and it doesn't swing like jazz does. But what it does show that they were highly competent black composers, band leaders, and musicians at that time, and equally less competent in terms of reading and music theory musicians in the Creole and white bands. As we said, in 1914, Memphis Blues is recorded by Charles Prince's band. And then 1915, we see the St. Louis Blues recorded by Charles Prince's band. Now, when I was researching into this, as I've said, the books that I've read have said that Charles Prince was a black artist and was one of the first black artists to be recorded. When I looked at photographs of him, I'm not too sure what race he is. And this comes up over and over again. You're looking at old photographs of people and going, well, I'm not too sure. Is that a white person or is that a black person? I would love to live in a world where we didn't have to do this. But of course, there are people out there that are shouting that jazz is black music. And I would love to find these musicians. In 1916, Wilbur Sweetman recorded Down Home Rag. And this was a group of mixed race musicians. In 1916, the Six Brown Brothers record Walking the Dog and Bullfrog Blues. This is a group that are white and perform in blackface and are really coming out of the minstrel tradition. But all of these are early recordings of jazz. In 1917, we see Livery Stable Blues recorded by the original Dixieland Jazz Band, and it's a huge hit record. But they are on to this. Also in 1917, we see that funny jazz band from Dixieland recorded by Arthur Collins and Byron G. Harlan, again, that come out of the minstrel shows. And in 1918, we get the original New Orleans jazz band recording Jada, which I would say is a lot more closer to what we know as serious jazz than the original Dixieland jazz band is. But what's interesting to me is once that record sold 1 million records, the commercial music scene that had now emerged and was making money out of selling 78 records went looking for jazz. I have been involved in music styles and genres as they emerge, and everybody's doing their thing, and then suddenly somebody has a hit record, it has a particular sound, and straight away the record companies and the producers are pushing you to sound like that. Now, if we go back to a lot of these early records, what's interesting about these jazz records, which nobody seems to mention, is they utilize the fact that they're recordings. There's improvisation on there, but there's also voiceovers and sound effects. They tell a little story. They're almost like progressive rock records in miniature. When we listen to Livery Stable Blues, we can hear the neighing and bleating of the animals. But when we listen to something like that funny jazz band from Dixieland by Arthur Collins and Byron G. Harlan, we can hear all sorts of voiceover and sound effects. It tells a story. When the genius musicians that are Louis Armstrong and Jelly Roll Morton get into the recording studio in the 1920s, they are playing within that style. But what is interesting is they are now putting bands specifically together to make recordings. And these recordings utilize the fact that they're recordings. Jazz is the first music style to utilize recording and to be able to use it to create the structure of the song. What I mean by that is the use of sound effects, the use of voiceovers, the use of sounds, emulating cars and trains, emulating steamboats, and to also utilize improvisation, and perhaps most importantly, to sell the idea of having a strong instrumental sound that belongs to you. These marching bands in New Orleans from 1865 to now have slowly moved from being precision bands that played Sousa marches to bands that could go into a recording studio and create something that could only exist on record, thus creating the recorded music industry. Bands follow suit. The early blues records like Mamie Smith, Ma Rainey, Bessie Smith are all tied directly to jazz. They're urban blues. And by this point, jazz is on the move and it's moving around the country and it's moving up to Chicago. I think this is where jazz begins. Now, America does not see the worth of what is going on. But if you're in the 1920s, what we're seeing is the emergence of the Harlem Renaissance. And they start to look around at the music that is going on then. And what they see is there's musicians like Sidney Bechet and Louis Armstrong and King Oliver and Jelly Roll Morton. And then later on, people like Duke Ellington, that are black musicians that are making music at a high art level. Pretty soon, this music has spread all over the world. In fact, we're seeing jazz groups all over the world by the early 1920s. And at this point, certain countries start to see the brilliance of this music form, specifically France, and a club is set up to celebrate how brilliant this music is, the Hot Club of France. And they put a band together which features two incredible musicians, Stefan Grappelli and Django Reinhardt. And at that point, jazz is international. Those two musicians did as much for jazz as any musician, black or white, from America. We also see the emergence in 1924 of the Wolverines, which then eventually goes into Paul Whiteman's band. And these contain musicians like Bix Beiderbecke. And Bix Beiderbecke was another absolute genius of jazz. Throughout the history of jazz, we see all people from all different backgrounds and cultures contributing to this style. But what they all have in common when you look at it, from Django Reinhardt to Bix Beiderbecke to Louis Armstrong, is they are outsiders. They are creative outsiders. To look at jazz in terms of privilege, in terms of identity, in terms of race or sexuality or any of that does not make sense. It is the music of the creatives, and they are all bound together like that. Louis Armstrong in the 1920s used to go and visit Bix Beiderbecke because he loved his playing. They used to sit and play together, even though the Jim Crow laws at the time would not allow it. And they did that because they loved each other's playing. Creativity goes beyond race. Creativity goes beyond identity. Now, I'm now at the end of this video, and I hope I have been able to explain how I see the early history of jazz. My next video is really going to look at the genius of Louis Armstrong and show how black musicians took these different music forms, these different styles, and consolidated and made it commercial. But once they had made it commercial, then went on to turn it into a high art form. And this is where we look at the great black jazz musicians, and this is why we look at them with great respect. And we feel like there's an essence in this music. And what is that essence? What is the thing that is contained in this music that you don't see in other music forms? The idea of people coming together from different backgrounds and being able to work with each other. Jazz is not a separatist music form. It is not the idea that the Ku Klux Klan had and the Democratic parties at that time, that black and white people should be kept separate. Jazz brought different people together. And why did it? I think it was because it was the only, or one of the few ways that black Americans could express the fact that they wanted to be a part of America. They wanted to be a part of this country and have access to the equal rights and the equalities that they saw all around them, but that could not access. And this is all driven by the stain of slavery. That the suffering of black people in America is the X factor, it's the essence, and it is the soul of jazz. If you want to call jazz black music because of that soul, I have no problem with that, and I understand that. But if you want to understand the history of this music, which is what I've tried to do on this video, you will see that it is the music of all Americans. And within that gumbo, it was black creative people that were able to make the most creative statements in this, which became an example to us all. Jazz is a wonderful music form, and it brings us together. And I hope this video, I've been able to bring some of these threads together in a way that haven't been done before, and show the fact that jazz is fundamentally about people coming together, which means, as with all great art, it is fundamentally about love, and it's a celebration of us getting along and getting on with it. I hope we can use the example of these incredible musicians to go forward into a future which at the moment is being torn apart by different tribes and different viewpoints and then different identities not being able to find common ground. Jazz is the art of common ground.